The following information is taken from the book What Really Makes You Ill? Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease Is Wrong by Don Lester and David Parker. This book is some 700 pages long, nearly 800 pages. There are 35 pages of source material for all the things that they talk about. I'm going to be reading about chapter 3, and these are the sources for that, if anybody ever wants to go and look them up. The two authors of this come from a background of accountancy and electrical engineering respectively. They researched this book for 10 years or so, and they came to some startling conclusions. I'm going to read from chapter 3. The germ theory. A theory ultimately is an untested hunch or a guess without supporting evidence. The germ theory, a deadly fallacy. Germs as a cause of disease is a dying fallacy, said Dr. John H. Tilden, MD. The information promulgated by the medical establishment about infectious diseases is based on the germ theory, the fundamental assertion of which is that germs invade the body and cause disease. The establishment definition describes a germ as any microorganism, especially one that causes disease. Disease-causing microorganisms are referred to as pathogens. A pathogen is a biological agent that causes disease or illness to the host, you and I. However, it is widely believed that all germs are pathogenic. This is not the case. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health, is a US government agency that conducts and supports biomedical research. As one of the key members of the medical establishment, the NIH is inevitably a proponent of the germ theory. The NIH website is a vast repository of information that includes more than 5 million archived medical journal articles. It also contains various educational materials, including books and teachers' guides. One of the online books in the curriculum supplement series of teachers' guides is entitled Understanding Emerging and Re-emerging Infectious Diseases. This book, which will be referred to as an infectious diseases book, describes microorganisms as the agents that cause infectious diseases, but adds the interesting comment that although microorganisms that cause disease are often receive the most attention, it is important to note that most microorganisms do not cause disease. With reference to the microorganisms that do cause disease, the book states that a true pathogen is an infectious agent that causes disease in virtually any susceptible host. The idea that a host must be susceptible before even a true pathogen can cause disease indicates that other factors must be involved, an idea that is inconsistent with the information about infectious diseases promulgated to the general public given to us as fact. It is, however, only one of many anomalies, inconsistencies and contradictions that are exposed by a genuine investigation of the medical establishment statements with respect to pathogens and infectious diseases that are claimed to cause, i.e. like a virus. Scientists state that the word theory does not refer to an idea, but that it has much more specific meaning. The first phase of a scientific investigation involves the creation of a general hypothesis, which is a suggested explanation for the subject under investigation. Experiments are then devised and conducted in order to discover more information about and gain a better understanding of the phenomena under review. The results of these experiments usually lead to the creation of a theory. which is intended to provide more comprehensive and compelling explanation for the phenomena than the explanation provided by the hypothesis. References by the medical establishment to the germ theory would therefore tend to suggest the existence of a number of established facts, which are that all germs have been thoroughly investigated and identified, that their ability to cause disease has been scientifically proven beyond doubt, and that the theory furnishes a comprehensive and compelling explanation for germs and the mechanisms by which they cause disease. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is a fundamental principle that the burden of proof lies with those who propose a theory. Yet, in the case of the germ theory, that proof does not exist. There is no original scientific evidence that definitely proves that any germ causes any specific infectious disease. Although this statement will be regarded as highly controversial and even outrageous, its veracity will be demonstrated by the discussions in this chapter. There are a number of sources that provide a corroboration of the assertion that the germ theory lacks any original scientific proof. One of these sources is Dr. M.L. Leverson, M.D., who in May 1911 gave a lecture in London in which he discussed his investigations that had led him to the conclusion that the entire fabric of the germ theory of disease rests upon assumptions which not only have not been proven, but which are incapable of proof, and many of them can be proved to be the reverse of the truth. The basic one of these unproven assumptions, wholly due to Louis Pasteur, is the hypothesis that all so-called infectious and contagious disorders are caused by germs. Corroboration is also provided by Dr. Bedow Bailey, who, in addition to exposing the lack of any scientific basis for vaccination, also exposed the lack of any scientific basis for the germ theory. In 1928, he wrote an article that was published in the journal London Medical World. In this article, Dr. Bedow Bailey states that, quote, I am prepared to maintain with scientifically established facts that in no single instance has it been conclusively proven that any microorganism is the specific cause of disease. It is clear that evidence to support the germ theory remained conspicuous by its absence more than half a century after it had been proposed by Louis Pasteur in the early 1860s. The situation has not been rectified in the intervening decades since 1928. The germ theory of disease remains unproven, with overwhelming evidence to demonstrate that it also remains a fallacy or a lie. Another critic of the prevailing ideas about disease in the 19th century was Florence Nightingale. During her long nursing career, she took care of many thousands of patients, and experience that proved to her that diseases were not individual entities with separately identifiable causes. In her 1860 book, entitled Notes on Nursing, she writes that, quote, I have seen diseases begin, grow up and pass into one another. She records that when the wards were overcrowded, the ordinary fevers with which patients suffered would change and worsen to become typhoid fever and worsen again to become typhus. These diseases are regarded as specific conditions caused by distinctly different pathogens. But Florence Nightingale reports that no new infection occurred, that the worsening of the diseases were the natural result of the unhealthy conditions that patients endured. Typically, these conditions included overcrowding, poor sanitation, lack of fresh air, and lack of hygiene, which are strikingly similar to the conditions in which smallpox thrived, which is another study. The idea that each specific pathogen causes a distinct disease is further explored in the next chapter, which is about bacteria, in which a number of different infectious diseases are discussed. They refer to other pages and such like, but I'm just sticking to the germ theory and viruses. It was shown in the previous chapter that the practice of vaccination was not originally based on the idea that germs were the causal agents of disease. Instead, it was based on the claim that a mild form of disease would provide a degree of protection against a more serious attack of disease. However, after Louis Pasteur's version of the germ theory gained increased popularity in the late 19th century, the idea of germs as the causal agents of disease became an extremely useful tool to justify the introduction of different vaccines to combat different infectious diseases. In the early 21st century, vaccinations are still justified on the basis that they prevent infectious diseases. The germ theory and the practice of vaccination are therefore inextricably interconnected. Together, they provide the foundation for a large proportion of medical establishment practices and consequently amount for a large proportion of pharmaceutical industry profits. It is Louis Pasteur who is generally hailed as the father of the germ theory. However, he was not the originator of the basic idea that diseases were caused by external infectious agents. Prior to the 19th century, a variety of ideas have been proposed that attempted to explain the nature of disease. Many of these ideas involved the existence of disease-causing entities. The earliest theories reported to have been that of Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro, who in 1546 proposed that disease is caused by minute entities that can transmit infection. His theory included the idea that the entities become pathogenic through heat, but Fracastoro was unable to observe the entities whose existence he had proposed. Microscopes with sufficient lens magnification were not available until more than 100 years later. It is reported in 1676, Antonius van Leeuwenhoek instructed a sufficiently powerful microscope to be able to view the small entities that are now recognised as bacteria. However, he proposed no theories about these entities or their functions. He merely observed them and wrote extensively about his observation in a correspondence he held with the Royal Society in London. It was almost another century later, in 1762, that Dr. M. Plenses, a Viennese physician, proposed a germ theory of infectious disease, a full century earlier than the theory attributed to Louis Pasteur. These historical facts have been extracted from the Book of Pasteur, Plagiarist Impostor, written by R.B. Pearson, whose source is a textbook entitled Historical Review of Microbiology, which was written by F. Harrison, who was Principal Professor of Bacteriology at McGill University. The long-held beliefs, customs and traditions that evolved into the various ideas about diseases and their causes are also discussed by Herbert Shelton in his July 1978 article entitled Disease is a Remedial Action, in which he states that, quote, this very old idea that disease is an entity that attacks the body and wreaks as much havoc therein as possible has taken several forms through the ages and is incarnated in the germ theory that holds sway today. William White explains in The Story of the Great Delusion that many of the old attitudes from ancient times persisted in the 18th century. Although an extract from his book was quoted in the previous chapter, one part of that extract deserves repetition. Quote, there was no scientific knowledge of the laws of health. Diseases were generally regarded as mysterious dispensations of providence, over which the sufferers had little control, and a great part of medicine was a combination of absurdity with nastiness. The old beliefs were gradually replaced by scientific theories, although the latter varied little from the ideas they replaced. The theories were often no more than variations on the basic ideas, which were that an external entity invades and infects the body, that the infection causes illness, and the sufferers have little control over their illness. More importantly, these scientific theories did not represent a significant advance in medical knowledge about disease or health, as Herbert Shelton states, quote, 100 years ago it was freely admitted that the nature and essence of disease was unknown. Unfortunately, the nature and essence of disease remains largely unknown to the medical establishment of the 21st century. The reason for this situation is mainly, but not exclusively, due to their rigid adherence to the germ theory, unproven. As demonstrated throughout this book, many medical establishment practices are based on erroneous and unproven theories, the problems with which are manifested by empirical evidence that demonstrates worsening rather than improving health for virtually the entire population of the world. Empirical evidence basically means is the information received by means of senses, particularly by seeing, observation and documented patterns in behaviour through experiment, i.e. research truth. Yet, despite the obvious contradictions between the theory and the empirical evidence, the medical establishment exhorts the public to believe their pronouncements about disease epidemic caused by dangerous germs on the basis that they are the authority on matters pertaining to health. Trust me, I'm a doctor springs to mind. In his book entitled Confessions of a Medical Heretic, Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, MD, indicates that belief in the authority of the medical establishment is misplaced. He expands on his discussion of the problems with modern medicine by reference to similarities between beliefs, religion, and modern medicine. He describes the medical establishment as the church of modern medicine, quote, and justifies this description by the statement that, quote, modern medicine can't survive without our faith. Because modern medicine is neither an art nor a science, it's a religion. Just ask why enough times, and sooner or later you'll reach the chasm of faith. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Science is an ongoing process of inquiry and discovery. This means that scientists should reassess theories that have been found to be flawed and generate more compelling explanations for the phenomena under review. Yet, the germ theory, which can be shown to be fundamentally flawed, has not been subjected to any rigorous reassessment. If it had been, scientists would have discovered that the theory is contradicted by a significant volume of empirical evidence, which is normally regarded as paramount. The intransience of the scientific community on this topic has turned the germ theory into dogma, not science. Dogma is a principle or set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true. Dr. Mendelsohn recommends that people ask the question why, but the problems with the germ theory require that people also ask the question how. Were they to do so, they would soon encounter the chasm of faith, which is likely to manifest as the familiar phrase, trust me, I'm a doctor. There you go. Although it is firmly believed by the medical establishment that Louis Pasteur's germ theory was significantly proven beyond any doubt, it has been revealed that the science he used in his experiments was not as meticulous as had been claimed. In his 1995 book entitled The Private Science of Louis Pasteur, historian Gerald Geeson refers to his investigation of Louis Pasteur's work that involved a comparison of his personal notebooks with his published papers. Journalist Torsten Endelbrecht and physician Klaus Colline, MD, provide extracts from Dr. Geeson's book. In their own book, Virus Mania, one of the extracts states that, quote, during his lifetime, Pasteur permitted absolutely no one, even his closest co-workers, to inspect his notes. Another extract from Dr. Geeson's book quoted the author's Virus Mania states that Pasteur, quote, arranged with his family that the books should also remain closed after his death. Although ideas that his possible motive for making this request can only be speculative, this arrangement does raise the question of why Louis Pasteur would not have wanted the basis of his world-famous work to be widely known. Torsten Engelbrecht and Dr. Colline provide a possible motive in the extremely revealing quote from Dr. Geeson's book in summary of the situation that states, the conclusion, quote, the conclusion is unavoidable. Pasteur deliberately deceived the public, including especially those scientists most familiar with his public work, didn't want his legend harmed by a lie. It is clear that Louis Pasteur, like Edward Jenner, had failed to earn the right to be revered or to be cited as a hero of modern medicine. The facts show they both contributed a great deal towards the sum of human illness, misery and suffering. all of which have resulted from the adoption of their theories by the medical establishment. It is unnecessary to provide full details of the history of the germ theory in order to be able to expose the flaws in which it has been based. One of these flaws arise from the basic assumption that infectious diseases and the meaning of the word infection, the establishment definition of which refers to, quote, invasion of the body by harmful organisms, pathogens. It is clear from this definition that an infection to be considered to be synonymous with the invasion by microorganisms and subsequent disease, but this is misleading as the body's ingenuous microorganisms also claim to be able to cause diseases, as indicated by Mayo Clinic web page entitled Infectious Diseases, which states that many organisms live in or on our bodies. They're normally harmless or even helpful, but under certain conditions some organisms may cause disease. This statement is highly anomalous. Although the Mayo Clinic webpage offers no further information about the conditions deemed necessary for otherwise harmless microorganisms to become pathogenic, harmful, it is suggested that germs consistently mutate to overpower the immune system and cause disease. Another explanation is offered by the infectious disease book, which states that the book's normal flora, quote, does not cause disease because their growth is kept under control by the host's defense mechanisms and by the presence of other microorganisms. The book claims that endogenous and invading microorganisms compete with each other, but that in normal circumstances the invaders are successfully suppressed. However, if its defense mechanisms are weak, the body may be overwhelmed by opportunistic pathogens which are described as, quote, potentially infectious agents that rarely cause disease in individuals with healthy immune systems. The medical establishment acknowledge that they possess a poor level of understanding about either the mechanisms involved or the conditions that cause endogenous organisms to be activated and become pathogenic. This is discussed in more detail in the section about bacteria. However, reliance on the immune system to prevent an invading pathogen from causing disease is problematic, as discussed in a previous chapter. It is claimed that the function of the immune system is to attack and destroy pathogens. This means that a strong and fully functioning immune system would be able to destroy all invaders, and that anyone with a strong immune system should therefore have no infectious agents, potential or otherwise, within their bodies. Microorganisms claimed to be pathogenic have, however, been found in the bodies of healthy people. One explanation for this situation is that some pathogens can exist in the body in a dormant state. But a strong immune system should not permit the presence of any pathogen, even if the so-called dormant state, that should subsequently be activated when the immune system has become weakened. The explanations offered by the medical establishment fail to genuinely address all of the anomalies within their explanations relating to the germ theory. This will become increasingly obvious as each type of germ is discussed in this chapter. The immune system is also discussed in another chapter. Unfortunately, their attempts to address these anomalous situations, the medical establishment creates even more complex explanations that do not provide clarification, but instead introduce further anomalies, inconsistencies and contradictions. The germ theory has become deeply embedded not only within modern medicine but also within the alternative health community. The belief in germs is so pervasive that virtually all physicians have accepted the ideas contained within the germ theory. This includes many of the doctors and physicians whose work is referenced in this book due to the valid criticism they have raised about the mainstream medical system. The efforts of the medical establishment to promote and emphasise the dangers of so-called infectious diseases is demonstrated by the WHO in the World Health Report 2007, which includes a statement that, quote, infectious diseases are emerging at a rate that has not been seen before. There is no explanation within the context of the germ theory for an accelerated rate of proliferation of germs, whether they are known germs that cause diseases believed to have been mostly conquered or newly discovered germs that cause previously unknown diseases. Just a bit of fear to keep you on your toes. There are, however, many reasons for the germ theory to be perpetuated, as if it had been scientifically established and proven to be true. Some of those reasons relate to economics, politics, geopolitics, which are discussed in another chapter. Other reasons relate to the need to justify the use of vaccines and medicines. But as this chapter will demonstrate, germs do not cause disease, a fact that adds further to the weight of evidence that vaccines and medicines are ineffective as methods to prevent or treat any so-called infectious diseases. I'll get to the vaccine, the virus parts shortly. Scientific experimentation. Science and technology have generated many innovations that have profoundly changed the way people live. These changes have accelerated substantially over the past 3 centuries since, and largely as a result of, the Industrial Revolution. The consequences of these changes have not always been beneficial. Many have been positively detrimental. One of the main consequences has been the almost total obstinance to science and the belief that it is the only method through which knowledge can be obtained. Dr. Mendelssohn's simile that modern medicine is like a religion can be extrapolated to apply to science, in which scientists have assumed the mantle of authority and become a new kind of priesthoods. Can't argue with a scientist, can you? This situation is highly problematic. Real science is a process of discovery, but the discipline of science has become largely authoritarian because its teachings are that scientific knowledge is the sole repository of truth, that only those who accept the consensus view are genuine scientists, and that any dissenting views are to be vilified and described in terms such as unscientific, pseudoscience, or any similarly disparaging labels. Conspiracy theory, maybe? The field of knowledge that has suffered the greatest harm from this dogmatic approach is that of health, in which dissenters are labelled as quacks. But the use of insults has no place in genuine scientific debate. The greatest error of scientists in this field, which is often referred to as medical science, originates from the false perception of the human body as essentially a machine of several parts that are fundamentally chemical in nature, meaning that a malfunction in each part can be fixed by altering its chemical nature. This error has been compounded by the equally erroneous idea that diseases are the lack of an attack on the body, mainly but not exclusively by germs. Furthermore, most scientists in the field of medicine regard the living human body as if it were inert. Inert basically means lacking the ability or strength to move. They effectively deny there is any role in the significance and production of illness or the restoration of health. To add insult to injury, the medical establishment maintains the stance that it is only their healthcare system, money, which operates from the basis of these ideas, that is capable of correctly addressing matters pertaining to health. Yet again, nothing could be further from the truth. These errors have been exposed to a certain extent by the previous 2 chapters, but they need to be further discussed in the context of infectious diseases and the science that continues to be conducted in the efforts to discover their causal agents. Science is fast becoming the authority for the entirety of life in the 21st century, but genuine science must be flexible. It must be open to new information that may require a revision of the prevailing theories or even a reassessment of the techniques and practices used by the scientific community. One of the main reasons for the problems within medical science and healthcare system it promotes is that most of the science is conducted within the confines of a laboratory. This means that laboratory experimentation is now entirely equated with medical science. It was done in a laboratory, so it's true. This is a fundamental error, and one that imposes a severe limitation on the ability of science to understand living organisms. Certain aspects of medical science involve empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is, again, it's information. It's basically research truth, and it can be shown to be. Yeah. Like, this is a fundamental error and one that exposes a limited. Right. Certain aspects of medical science and empirical obtains from the experiences of real people in the real world. For example, adverse events resulting from the use of medicines or vaccines that have been approved and released onto the market. Chapters 1 and 2 demonstrated that there's a great deal of evidence that contradicts the promoted claims that medicine and vaccines are safe. This book basically pokes holes and shows with evidence that most things we are taught from the Black Death, the Spanish flu, which is topical at the moment, are not quite what people think they are. Empirical evidence is, however, largely ignored when assessing the claims of medical science. It is acknowledged that some tests and experiments are conducted outside the laboratory environment, although they usually follow extensive experimentation within the laboratory. Most of these initial experiments are conducted on humans or animal tissues, cells or molecules, and involve the use of a variety of chemical substances that are tested for these reactions on the various tissues, cells and molecules in the hope that beneficial effect will be observed. It is reported that a new drug takes approximately 10 years to develop from the initial experiment in which apparently beneficial effect has been observed to its availability in the market. This period of 10 years includes the various clinical trials that are conducted with healthy human subjects on which the side effects of the drugs are tested. Many of these trials are conducted over relatively short periods of time, often a few months or sometimes only a few weeks. It is generally perceived that the results from laboratory experiments have a direct relevance to human health. However, the fact that experiments conducted by medical science are performed on tissues, cells or molecules raises the fundamental question about how these experiments relate to the functioning of a living human body, whether in health or disease. One of the few scientists to have raised questions about the laboratory procedures used for the experimentation of cells and tissues is Dr. Harold Hillman, PhD, who has a London University degree in medicine and in psychology and a doctorate in biochemistry, and therefore is eminently qualified to comment on the problems he had discovered. The investigations he conducted over his long career have resulted in the bold assertion that most preparation methods directly affect the cells, tissues to be examined or even change their structure. So what they do to them actually affects the outcome. This assertion is supported by Bruce Lipton, PhD, who observed in his experiments that changes he made to the culture medium had a direct effect on the activity and health of the cells contained in the culture. He reports his findings in June 2012 article entitled The Wisdom of Your Cells, which includes the statement that, quote, "If I changed the environmental situation, the fate of the cells would be altered." Dr. Hillman had made a number of his articles available on his website, but this ceased to be active after his death in 2016. Although these articles remained unpublished, that does not deny their veracity. The idea that only peer-reviewed, published papers are valid is a mistaken one, as will be discussed in more detail in another chapter. In his 2013 paper entitled A Serious Indictment of Modern Cell Biology and Neurobiology, he discusses the results of investigations conducted since 1970 and refers to molecular biology as, quote, "the chemistry of living intact biological systems." This highlights one of the key features of, as well as the main problems with laboratory experimentation, which is that it does not investigate the living intact biological systems. In his 2011 paper entitled Cell Biology at the Beginning of the 21st Century is in Dire Straits, Dr. Hillman details preparations required. Quote, "When a tissue is prepared for histology, histochemistry, electron microscopy, or immunochemistry, an animal is killed, the tissue is excised, and it is fixed or frozen. It is embedded, or it is sectioned, it is rehydrated, or it is stained, or it is mounted, it is radiated by light, or bombarded by electron beams." A particularly salient point is that any tissue sample that is to be examined is clearly no longer alive after it has been subjected to these principal procedures. Dr. Hillman explains in his 2013 paper that there is a complete lack of recognition of the effects of such preparations and procedures on the tissue sample to be examined, and comments that, quote, "Biologists have shown little evidence in the effects that the procedures they use have on the structure and chemistry of the tissues they are studying. The same can be said for the chemists who investigate chemical reactions on cells, tissues and molecules, or COVID-19. In addition to the effects of the procedures on the chemistry of tissue, the effects on the structure must also be considered. The failure to do so is one of Dr. Hillman's main criticisms of the preparation procedures. He claims that these procedures generate artifacts that are then perceived to be genuine features of the tissue sample or a cell that is under examination. He explains that, quote, "This has led them into the study of many artifacts and distortions of the chemistry of living systems." An artifact is an artificial structure not present in the living tissue, something added later, basically. One of the main laboratory methods used to view germs, especially viruses, is the electron microscope. Dr. Hillman provides a revealing statement about the results of the preparation procedures used for this technology. Quote, "Electron microscopists have ignored the dictates of solid geometry, and most of the apparent structures they have detected are artifacts, something added, of their own preparation procedures. There are profound consequences of this revelation for the germ theory, and especially for the examination of viruses, which are discussed in the next section. This is a further important point to be emphasised, which is that even when a live sample is examined by procedures, they do not kill it. For example, during dark field microscopy, that sample, whether cell, molecule or other type of tissue, has been removed from its normal environment, an environment in which it is an integral part of the intact living system. There are very few conclusions that can be drawn from experiments that take place under the very specific conditions of laboratory environment and assumed to be meaningful to the health of a healthy living body. The internal environment of the human body bears no resemblance to whatsoever to the artificial environment created by scientists for the experiments in laboratory. Furthermore, it is appropriate to take the results of experiments that test the reactions of chemicals with dead tissues, cells or molecules and extrapolate them to intact living organisms, which do not react and respond to chemicals in ways that can be predicted by experiments conducted on individual pieces of tissue. The idea behind the assumption that extrapolates are appropriate is a mistake of profound proportions. It is a major flaw within the field of medical science. Nevertheless, it is this idea that permits scientists to continue to believe that laboratory experiments are conducted on germs are appropriate in order to gain a better understanding of the process of diseases. The most fundamental error is, however, the basic idea that germs cause disease. Exposure of the evidence that this is an error requires a better understanding of the entities that are referred to as germs, which are discussed in greater details in the ensuing sections. Viruses. The establishment definition of a virus refers to it as a minute particle that is capable of replication but only within living cells. All viruses have a basic structure described by the definition as follows, quote, "Each consists of a core of nucleic acid, DNA or RNA surrounded by a protein shell. In addition, some types of virus have lipid or an envelope, which gives rise to the classification as enveloped virus. Without this structure are called non-envelopes." The definition also claims that viruses are the cause of many diseases, as if this has been definitely proven. But this is not the case. There is no original scientific evidence that definitely demonstrates that any virus is the cause of any disease. The burden of proof for any theory lies with those who propose it, but none of the existing documents provides proof that supports the claim that viruses are pathogens. Although Dr. Levison and Dr. Bedouin-Bailey wrote their comments exposing the lack of scientific proof prior to the invention of the electron microscope, Dr. Hillman's work was subsequent to its invention. He exposed many flaws that arise from the use of that particular piece of technology for the study of viruses. The fundamental problem lies with the use of the term virus and the idea that it refers to pathogenic microorganism. During the 19th century, scientists who believed in the germ theory had been able to discover a variety of bacteria that appeared to be associated with a number of the diseases that they were investigating. However, they were unable to find a bacterial or even a fungal agent associated with some of those diseases, which led them to the belief that there had to be some other organism that was responsible for other diseases. They believed that it must be an organism that was too small to be seen through the optical microscopes of the period. It was only after the invention of the electron microscope in the 1930s that particles smaller than bacteria could be observed in samples taken from people with certain diseases. It was these tiny particles that became known as viruses and assumed to be the causal agents of all diseases that could not be attributed to bacteria. The discovery of particles in samples taken from people with a disease and the assumption that this represents a causal relationship is akin to blaming firemen as being the cause of fires because they are directly associated with fire and often found at the premises that are ablaze. This analogy serves to highlight the potentially dire consequences that can result from misinterpretation of an observed phenomena and from incorrect assumptions that are an association between the different factors involved. It may be claimed that the association between viruses and human disease has been experimentally observed and scientifically established, but as will be demonstrated, this would be an incorrect claim. The word virus has been used for centuries in connection with diseases and was certainly in use long before the particles, now called viruses, were first seen or even theorised. This situation is a major source of confusion on the topic. It is, however, incorrect to assume that the particles that are now called viruses are the same entities to which earlier writings referred. All the evidence indicates that the early writings used the word virus in the context of its original meaning, which is from the Latin from a poison or noxious substance. Careful reading of 18th and 19th century writings, particularly those that refer to smallpox inculation and vaccination, show that the use of the word virus is clearly intended to refer to some kind of noxious matter. This can be demonstrated by the practice of inoculation, which used the pus from sores on the skins of people with smallpox called. This pus was often referred to by the word virus. The same word was also used to refer to the pus from sores on udders of cows with the disease called cowpox. The pus from sore bears a far closer resemblance to the original meaning of virus as a poison or noxious substance than to an infectious particle. The word infection was also used in many of the writings of 18th and 19th centuries, but not in the context in which it is now used to refer to the invasion of a germ. In those writings, the word was used in the context of referring to someone that contaminates or pollutes. Taking the pus from a person's skin sores and inoculating it into cuts made in the skin of a healthy person will certainly contaminate and pollute that person's bloodstream. There is no need to invoke the existence of minute particle to explain ensuing illness resulting from blood poisoning. The definition of germ refers to it as a microorganism. The definition of an organism refers to a living thing. Interestingly, the establishment definition of a virus does not refer to it as an organism, which would tend to suggest that a virus is not considered to be alive. There is an ongoing lively debate on the issue of whether viruses are alive or not, but there are some basic functions that an entity must exhibit in order for it to be defined as living, which shows that the issue cannot be one of differing opinions. It is a matter of asserting the facts. Dr. Lynn Margus, PhD, a renowned biologist and member of the prestigious National Academy of Sciences from 1983 until her death in 2011, provides an explanation in her book entitled Symbiotic Planet of the distinction between the living and non-living. She refers to viruses as non-living and explains that they are not alive since outside living cells they do nothing, ever. Viruses require the metabolism of the live cell because they lack the requisites to generate their own. Metabolism, the incessant chemistry of self-maintenance, is an established feature of life. Viruses lack this. In other words, they don't fly about outside the body. An August 2008 Scientific American article entitled Are Viruses Alive? Provides an interesting insight into the changing perception of viruses. Quote, first seen as poisons, then as life forms, then as biological chemicals, viruses today are thought of as being in a grey area between living and non-living. End quote. Although categorising viruses as being in a grey area, the article nevertheless asserts that they are pathogenic. Quote, in the late 19th century, researchers realised that certain diseases, including rabies, foot and mouth, were caused by particles that seemed to behave like bacteria but were much smaller, end quote. This assertion tends to support the idea that viruses must be alive because they are claimed to behave like bacteria, which are living entities. That's why if you get the common colds are bacteria. That's why you should maybe wash your hands and such, like if you've got the cold and around people. As we'll be discussing in the next session, the use of the word realise is intended to convey the impression that these diseases have been proven to be caused by those smaller particles. This impression is, however, misleading. This is clearly a significant effort to promote the view that viruses are living entities. The main reason for this is because this view helps to justify the claims that viruses are infectious agents that can be transmitted between people and deadly diseases, cause deadly diseases. But there is a major problem with the idea that viruses can be transmitted between people because, as Dr. Margelis states, quote, any virus outside the membrane of a live cell is inert, lacks the strength, or is basically not alive, end quote. Widespread public knowledge that viruses are non-living particles that are inert outside of the host cell would make it a great deal more difficult for the medical establishment to justify their claims that these particles are dangerous and cause many deadly diseases. COVID-19. The revelation that viruses are not living particles clearly raises two fundamental questions about their alleged functions. The first is how inert particles are able to move and be transmitted between people. The second is how viruses are able to enter the body and infect cells. The description of a virus as inert means that it lacks the ability to move by itself, to fly about, etc., etc. This lack of self-propelled motion is acknowledged by the medical establishment that refers to viruses as not motile. Nevertheless, they attempt to explain the apparent ability of viruses to move and be transmitted between people by the claim that they ride or hitchhike on various other particles that can travel through the environment. Sneezes. This ride is said to cease when the virus particle makes contact with a new host to infect. The problem with this explanation is that it fails to explain how a virus escapes from the host cell if it is not motile. It also fails to explain how the virus is able to find and hitch itself to the appropriate particle that is going to be ejected from the body during a sneeze or a cough. The second question requires an explanation of the method by which a virus is claimed to be able to infect a cell. The web page of UCMP, University of California Museum of Pathology, Berkeley, entitled Introduction to Virus, states that when it comes into contact with a host cell, a virus can insert its genetic material into its host. The purported mechanism described in a little more detail in July 2007 article entitled Imagining Poliovirus Entry into Living Cells, the abstract of which begins, quote, viruses initiate infection by transferring their genetic material across a cellular membrane and into the appropriate compartment of the cell, close quote. This insertion or transfer assumes that the virus takes an active part in these mechanisms, but the idea that a virus can be active is contradicted by Dr. Margelis and others who state categorically that a virus is inert outside of a living cell. It's dead, basically. In 2007 article makes a highly revealing statement, quote, the mechanisms by which animal viruses, especially non-enveloped viruses, deliver their genomes are only poorly understood, close quote. The article also reveals that how non-enveloped viruses, such as poliovirus, enter target cells is not well understood, close quote. These statements are not only profoundly revealing but also astounding, considering that the idea of viral infection rests on the theory that viruses enter cells in order to cause disease. These statements clearly demonstrate how little is actually known about viruses and their alleged mechanism of action in causing an infection. It should be obvious that a great deal of the information about viruses promulgated by the medical establishment put out is based on a collection of unproven assumptions and suppositions. This lack of known facts about viruses can be demonstrated by the example of a cold virus that is claimed to be transmitted via saliva or mucus particles when a person sneezes or coughs. These particles are said to be inhaled by another person who then becomes infected by the virus, which travels through the person's body to appropriate cells of the lung tissue. The transmission of any viral particle attached to saliva travelling through the air has never truly been observed, Viral particles are only ever observed in laboratory under electron microscope. The transmission of viruses in the air is an assumption, as is their ability to travel through the human body. A further contradiction of the theory that viruses are transmitted between people can be seen from another common infectious disease, namely influenza or the flu. The worst outbreak of this disease is reported to have occurred in 1918 and to have killed many tens of millions of people. The number of people reported to have died as a result of the epidemic varies widely, from about 20 million to 100 million, which raises many questions about the veracity of these claims and about the number of genuine casualties from the flu rather than the effects of World War I. There are also many reports that claim the real duration of the epidemic to have been far longer than a single year. The reason that a huge number of people died during this period is claimed to be because the disease was highly contagious. There are, however, many problems with such claims. The 1918 flu is discussed in greater detail on our channel. The epidemic of 1918 is usually referred to as a viral disease, although initially there were ideas that it was caused by a bacterium. Herbert Shelton describes some of the early experiments conducted on volunteers from the US Naval Detention Camp to determine the alleged bacterial cause and to test the transmission of the flu. In his book entitled The Hygienic System, Volume 16, Orthopathy, he describes one of the experiments conducted to test the transmission of the disease that explains that, quote, 10 other men were carried to the bedside of 10 new cases of influenza and spent 45 minutes with them. Each well man had 10 sick men cough in his face. He records the results of the experiments were, quote, none of these volunteers developed any symptoms of influenza following the experiment. So basically, they had 10 healthy men sit with 10 unwell men, and they had each of the 10 men cough in each of the 10 men's face. It may be suggested that 10 is too small a number to be statistically significant sample size, but this argument would miss the salient point, which is that each healthy man had 10 sick men cough in his face and none of them became ill, a fact that contradicts the idea that viral particles hitchhike onto saliva or mucus that is ejected from the body during a sneeze or a cough. According to the germ theory according to the germ theory, all of the healthy men should have been infected by viruses and became ill. The fact that they did not fall ill poses a direct and serious challenge to the basic assumption that flu is infectious. Exceptions to any rule is an indication that the rule is flawed and needs to be re-examined. The empirical evidence is primary. The lack of understanding by the medical establishment about the mechanism for the viral infection of cells has not improved since the publication of the 2007 poliovirus article previously referred to. There remain both a lack of understanding about and the absence of proof of the mechanism involved. This lack of progress is indicated by an August 2015 article entitled Non-Envelope Virus Hijacks Host Deaggregation Machinery to Translocate Across the Endoplasmic Reticulum Membrane, which states that, quote, how non-enveloped viruses penetrate a host membrane to enter cells and cause disease remains an enigmatic step. Otherwise, I don't know. Dr. Hillman identified the endoplasmic reticulum as one of the artifacts that are generated as a result of the preparation procedures needed to view viruses under an electron microscope. It's whatever they do to it changes the actual outcome. The website of the Encyclopedia of Life, a project that promotes the medical establishment view, contains a page about viruses and refers to them as microscopic organisms, which demonstrates the efforts to present the case that viruses are alive. The lie. To further promote this view, the ELO web page contains information about the stages in a viral life cycle, the first stage of which is claimed to be in which a virus attaches itself to a cell. The page states that, quote, attachment is the intermolecular binding between viral capsid proteins and receptors on the outer membrane of the host cell, close quote. The problem with this explanation is that Dr. Hillman also identified receptors as cellular artifacts that are generated by the preparation procedures used in the experiments. It's what they put in it that changes the outcome. It is claimed that once a virus has penetrated the cell, it will replicate, which is said to initiate the disease process. The EOL webpage refers to the numerous mechanisms involved in this process that includes cell lysis and the ultimate death of the cell. The page makes a significant statement that, in quote, in multicellular organisms, if sufficient numbers of the cells die, the whole organism may suffer gross metabolic disruption or even mortality, close quote. There is a huge problem with this statement, which is that many billions of humans' cells die every day. Cell death is a normal part of the processes of human life. The idea that cell death is synonymous with disease is therefore highly misleading. It completely contradicts known biological functions of the human body. The reason that cell death is perceived to be a disease process is because this is what is likely to have been observed during laboratory experimentations, faulty ones. However, there are genuine reasons for cells to die after tissue samples have been subjected to various preparation procedures used in laboratory experimentation, as explained by Torsten Engelbrecht and Dr. Colin in Virus Mania. Quote, this phenomena is particularly virulent in bacterial and viral research and in the whole pharmaceutical development of medicines altogether, where laboratory experiments on tissue cells, which are tormented with a variety of highly reactive chemicals, allow few confusions about reality. And yet conclusions are consistently drawn and then passed straight on to the production of medications and vaccines. Close quote. This explanation exposes the fundamental error in conducting laboratory research without an adequate understanding of the living organism that is the human body. It also clearly supports the conclusions drawn by Dr. Hillman that laboratory procedures affect the samples being investigated to the point that they bear no resemblance to reality. Yet most scientific information about viruses derive from laboratory experiments of this nature. In these experiments, viruses are reported to have replicated inside a cell, after which the cell dies. This procedure does not prove that the virus killed the cell, nor does it prove that the virus initiates any disease processes. It merely proves that the cell died after the processes used in the experiments. These points are also raised in Virus Mania, in which the authors state, quote, another important question must be raised. Even when a supposed virus does kill cells in a test tube in vitro, can we safely conclude that these findings can be carried on to living organisms in vitro? Close quote. The assumption that a particular viral particle causes a particular infection is solely based on the claim that certain antibodies sometimes be found in samples extracted from some people exhibiting certain symptoms. In other words, there appears to be a correlation between symptoms and antibodies. It should be noted that viruses are not detected directly. However, many people are diagnosed as suffering from viral illness without any investigations or tests having been conducted or ascertain whether they have been infected by an allegedly pathogenic virus. A diagnosis is frequently based on the different symptoms that a patient experiences and reports to their doctor. People can also be discovered to have virus in their body without exhibiting the specific symptoms of the disease it is alleged to cause. This is claimed to represent the dormant stage of the virus, as discussed in the EOL webpage that states, quote, although viruses may cause disruption of normal homeostasis resulting in disease, in some cases viruses may simply reside in an organism without significant harm. Close quote. Although the virus may be dormant and therefore harmless, it is claimed that there is a potential for the virus to be activated and to initiate the relevant disease. In their efforts to justify the existence of an allegedly dormant virus in the body, the medical establishment has created the term latent infection. The following extract from the Yale Medical Group website page entitled All About Viruses shows how the medical establishment attempts to explain what is clearly an anomaly. Quote, varical viruses are examples of viruses that cause latent infections. The varical roster virus remains in the body after causing the initial infection, known as chickenpox. If it is reactivated, it travels through the nerves to the skin, where it causes the blister-like lesions of shingles. The virus then returns to its dormant state, end quote. Despite the claim that they explain all about viruses, these statements are made without any supportive evidence. There is no explanation for any of these stages of allegedly latent infection, nor is there any explanation for the mechanisms by which a virus becomes dormant or is reactivated. Yet the germ theory is still claimed to have been scientifically proven and to provide a comprehensive and compelling explanation for viruses and the infectious diseases they are alleged to cause. There are only a few brave scientists who have been prepared to contradict the medical establishment and acknowledge publicly that viruses are not pathogenic. One such scientist is Dr. Ling Margus, who states in Symbiotic Planet that, quote, the point that bears mentioning, however, is that viruses are no more germs and enemies than are bacteria or human cells, close quote. Another of these brave scientists is Dr. Stefan Lanka, PhD, a German biologist who studied virology as well as molecular biology, oncology, and marine biology. An interview with Dr. Lanka, conducted in 2005 for the online German newspaper Faktul, the interview, which has fortunately been translated into English, reveals that the topics of discussion included bird flu and vaccination. During the interview, Dr. Lanka refers to his studies in molecular biology and made the bold claim that, quote, in the course of my studies, I and others have not been able to find any proof of the existence of disease-causing viruses anywhere, close quote. He continues to discuss his research and explains further, quote, we have discoursed on this publicly and have called on people not to believe us either, but to check out themselves whether or not there are disease-causing viruses, close quote. That's a good thing, you don't just take somebody's word for it, go and look into it yourself. He also stated in the interview that he and a number of other people had been questioning the German authorities for the proof of pathogenic viruses. He reports that the result of their efforts resulted in, quote, the health authorities are no longer maintaining that any virus whatsoever purportedly causing a disease has been directly proven to exist, close quote. The statement that no disease-causing virus has been directly proven to exist highlights another crucial fact. That is, the presence of a virus in the body is not determined directly, but only through the detection of antibodies that the body is alleged to have produced against the virus. There is no test that is able to directly detect the presence of a whole virus, COVID-19. The real purpose and function within the human body of these particles, genetic material contained within a protein containing coating, are unknown. The claim that they cause disease remains entirely unproven. It's probably exosomes that go and sort stuff out. So the stuff they're picking up in these tests is just detritus from these infections and such like that we pick up through ordinary life, breathing, polluted air, etc., etc. Dr. Lanka was also interviewed in April 2016, this time by David Crow, for his internet programme The Infectious Myth on the Progressive Radio Network. In this interview, Dr. Lanka again asserted that there is no evidence that proves any virus to be the cause of any disease, and that the theories about infectious diseases are wrong. He also discussed the details of his recent court case that arose from a challenge he had set a number of years earlier. This challenge was that a certain sum of money would be paid to anyone who produced genuine scientific proof of the existence of the measles virus. It was €100,000. The purpose of this challenge was to expose the fallacy of the claim that measles is caused by a virus. In 2015, a German doctor accepted the challenge. The basis of his proof was set on 6 published papers that he claimed provided the necessary evidence. Dr. Lanka, however, claimed that the paper did not contain the required evidence and refuted the doctor's claim to the reward money. This dispute resulted in a court case that found in the favour of the German doctor. The court's decision that the papers provided the required proof and that Dr. Lanka had therefore lost his case were widely reported in the mainstream media and media outlets, some of which also contained disparaging comments about Dr. Lanka personally. However, Dr. Lanka maintained his claim that the papers did not provide the required proof and appealed against the court's decision. The appeal was heard in early 2016 and the decision this time was found in the favour of Dr. Lanka. This was taken to the Supreme Court in Germany, ultimately. In other words, it was found that the papers failed to provide the necessary proof. The mainstream media, however, were noticeably silent about the result of this appeal. The lack of media coverage of Dr. Lanka's successful appeal is revealing, especially as it coincided with reports about a number of outbreaks of measles cases in the early months of 2016. But these reports studiously avoided making any reference to the court case that demonstrated that no evidence exists that proves measles to be caused by a virus or any virus. It should be clear that this discussion that no disease is caused by a virus. It should be clear from this discussion that no disease is caused by a virus. In his interviews, Dr. Lanka urges people to investigate for themselves if there is a genuine evidence for any disease-causing viruses. The authors of this book make the same request and ask people to investigate for themselves whether any virus has been conclusively proven to be the cause of any infectious disease. Any investigation of this nature should involve contact with the organisation that claim viruses to be the cause of disease, to ask them the following questions, and we should be asking our governments this. Is there an electron micrograph of the pure and fully characterised virus? What is the name of the primary specialist peer-reviewed paper in which the virus is illustrated and its full genetic information described? What is the name of the primary publication that provides proof that a particular virus is the sole cause of a particular disease? These questions should be asked to our governments. It is vitally important that any documents referred to by the organisation, should they reply, must be primary papers, textbooks or other reference materials that are not primary documents. Materials that are not primary documents are not acceptable. They must be primary evidence. It should be noted that investigations of this nature, including those undertaken by virologists such as Dr. Lanka, have failed to unearth any original papers that conclusively prove that any virus is the cause of any disease. In addition to this discussion has demonstrated the functions attributed to viruses and the causation of disease are based on assumptions, extrapolations from laboratory experiments, which are null and void, that have not only failed to prove but are incapable of proving that viruses cause disease. The inert non-living particles known as viruses do not possess the ability to perform such functions because they lack the necessary mechanism.